Originally I was going to do this video on just the Jet Set Willy games, as this was the only one in the series that I actually kind of knew of, but from my research I found out it's actually a sequel, so I decided it'd be best to talk about all of them. And in this video I'm going to talk specifically about Manic Miner, the first game from the Miner Willy series that really pioneered the route for video games today. The Miner Willy series is a series of games that were originally programmed and released on the ZX Spectrum and began with the first game, Manic Miner, being released in 1983. If you aren't familiar with the game or the series, Manic Miner opens like this. I mean, considering that these were some of the first ever games to pioneer the work of games today, it could be a lot worse. So how did it all begin? Let's take a quick history lesson behind the making of this game, because trust me, there's a lot. In 1982, a company called Sinclair Research, founded by a Clive Sinclair, released an at-home personal computer named the ZX Spectrum. This thing is older than me, most Let's Play YouTubers, and about a year older than the release of the Nintendo NES, i.e. pretty old. And at the time of its release, it sold for just £125, and taking into account inflation, that would roughly equate to about £450 today. This was remarkably cheap compared to the US counterpart Commodore 64, which cost about $600, which would be about £4,197.54 today. That might be slightly off, I got a C in maths, all you need to know is that it was expensive. The fact that the ZX Spectrum was so cheap was revolutionary for its time, as it enabled a large spread access amongst schools, and it was being introduced at home, which was during a time when console gaming wasn't really a thing. This led to an influx of what is now known today as the bedroom programmer. Remember that term because we'll be getting back to it later. There's a very good video about this from a channel by the name of Game Maker's Toolkit in which they talk about this in much more detail, but I'll dumb it down to the basics. However, I will link their video in the description as it's a really good source of my information and I want to give credit where credit is due. But put simply, all of these microcomputers had, quote, a version of BASIC, an easy-to-use programming language. This made it incredibly easy for people to learn how to program, put their data on a cassette, pass it around for their friends to see, or maybe put an advert in the paper for a couple of quid to gain traction. One of these programmers was none other than a Matthew Smith. Matthew Smith, no, not that one, is the primary brains behind these games. He's a very talented self-taught programmer. He actually programmed these games on the TRS-80 and would move all of his work onto the Spectrum. This now leads us on to the long-forgotten Bug Byte. Bug Byte was a game development company founded in 1980 by Tony Baden and Tony Milner, wonder what they have in common, that created 8-bit games for systems such as Sinclair, Commodore, and particularly the Spectrum. Unfortunately, the company went into voluntary liquidation in 1985 due to a difficult financial year, but they were responsible for the widespread development of video games and helped put Britain on the market for video gaming. So, as I was saying, Tony Squared teamed up with Matthew Smith, no not that one, to create the game Manic Miner. You play as a simple miner, Willy, who stumbles upon an old, long-forgotten mineshaft. He begins to learn of an ancient civilization that used to live under the ground that would harvest the Earth's raw materials and were far more industrially advanced than our world. They were in every way far more superior in terms of civilization than us, and lived in peace for centuries. But one day, war broke out, which in turn wiped them out, but the robots from within the mine never stopped working and collecting valuable materials. Miner Willy is big brain and realises that if he collected these materials then he could make a lot of cash money, so he ventures down and has to avoid enemies such as poisonous pansies, spiders and, quote, manic mining robots. These enemies appear in the cassette inlay when you purchase the game, but I see how they failed to mention the mutant phones. So, unless you've played the game, and in some cases even if you have played it, the story might not be glaringly clear. Back then, they didn't focus so much on the massive storytelling element, they were more focused on making just a playable game. Don't forget, around this time some of the biggest games were games such as Burger Time, Donkey Kong, and the glorious Dig Dug. I love Dig Dug. So during that time, as lots of the games for platformers with very similar functions, been profiting off the same idea of jump good and don't die. Like previously stated, the big priority for game development at the time was to make sure their game functioned. Now, any person and their dog could create a game and release it on Steam or GameJolt without any fuss, with its questionable taste level and minimum requirements, and a game running isn't so much of a requirement these days. However, back then gaming was very new and fascinating and very difficult. There was a lot of stuff that had to be considered back then, as whilst times weren't that ancient, you'd be surprised at how much different things were. For example, in the UK in 1982, there were only 3 TV channels. Yep, that's right, 3. These were BBC, BBC Two, and ITV. I won't go into much detail about the origins of those channels. I could, but it's not the time. It shows how far we've come over the past almost 40 years, and how, if you like games, you should probably appreciate that we went from gameplay like this to this. When the game starts, it greets you with a flashing screen and the first level comes up. The game is fairly simple. You can only move left and right, and you can jump up and down. In order to progress through the levels, you have to jump up and reach all of the flashing items, which will unlock a portal for you to progress to the next level. Each level has an air meter. Since Willy is underground, he can only have a limited amount of air. This air meter's there to add a challenge into the game and make sure that players don't spend too long in a certain area. Running into a flashing enemy or running out of air would game end you, and if you ran out of lives, you'd have to start again all the way from the beginning. At the bottom of each level, there's a small line of text which tells you what room you're in. In total, there are 20 levels to beat, though some people claim there's 22, and this might seem like nothing given the simplistic gameplay and level design, but it's not actually the easiest feat to pull off. Since games were so small, if they weren't, they would have been beaten and forgotten within a day. The game presented challenge, and when kids played it, they'd then talk about it with their friends to see who got furthest or who was actually able to beat the game, something that people still don't think is possible today. There's a few things to note when it comes to this game when it comes to not only the gameplay, but also the world building as well. In an interview with Matthew Smith, he talks about things he had to consider when making this game. One of the things he talks about is the fact that the background in Manic Miner is black, as back then, there was a problem with at-home consoles. They were well known for burning images into the television. Now, if it was just your TV, then you probably wouldn't care that much, but since back then you likely used a family TV, it would become a lot more of a problem. This wasn't too different to other titles at the time. If you look at these pictures, all of these backgrounds from these famous games are black. In part, this is likely just because video games at the time had a limited colour palette, as they would have needed to save what little space they had. They would have needed that space to load up things like sprites or tiles. Given that there are an awful lot of enemies and in turn sprites in this game, it's also likely a good reason why the background's black, while the other colours are so bright. This is why a lot of popular games from the time, including games like Metroid being set in space and Donkey Kong which is set underground, have dark backgrounds. It's not just a detail, it ties into the storytelling element. Of course, this isn't always the case, and there are many exceptions to this, such as My Beloved Dig Dug, Frogger, and that. The levels appear somewhat repetitive as they all follow a similar theme but with a different layout. I'll show you some of the different levels and you'll see what I'm talking about. The level that's seemingly the most difficult from the others is the final level, with half of the level being above ground to signify that you've successfully made it out and can now cash in your findings for some dollar bills. Other than that, the rest of them have similar patterns with different colour variations. This game was fairly revolutionary as it was the first Spectrum game to actually include sound in-game. As you've seen, the title screen opens up with a wide array of colours and an arrangement of the Blue Danube plays. Just in case you forgot. This was revolutionary at the time as sound didn't have too much room within games. As you enter and play through the levels, In the Halls of the Mountain King by Edvard Grieg plays. This is a song most people are familiar with, and here's a snippet of what it sounds like in game. The use of music within this game definitely aids the player into feeling full of adrenaline or makes them feel like the game is quite fast paced. another clever tactic to make it feel high stakes and to make you play it over and over again to try and complete it. Obviously, in video games now, a good soundtrack heightens the experience of a game, however, overall does not hold as much weight as what the soundtrack for this game does. This game also featured jumping sound effects, which have a slightly rubber sound to them. This is due to the fact that the Spectrum used what was known as a membrane keyboard. The membrane keyboard was incredibly fragile, so to try and protect it, they used rubber on the keys. It was also down to cost. A rubber keyboard ultimately cost less than a mechanical one. Not only that, but a mechanical one would have potentially made the system as a whole bigger, which would have made the cardboard boxes that they were shipped in bigger, which would have made shipping prices higher, and you get the picture. And this might not seem like a lot for you and I, but in the world of business and budgeting, they would want to keep the cost down to a minimum. So how much of a cultural impact did Miner Willy have? If your answer was absolutely none, you could not be more wrong. As stated previously, Manic Miner helped bring rise to the aforementioned bedroom programmers. Dr. Alex Wade from Birmingham City University wrote a book titled Playback, a genealogy of 1980s British video games, in which he states, "Without experiencing the quasi-legal, ethically hazy practices of the UK coders, crackers and copyists of the 1980s, the field of video games simply wouldn't be worth the billions of pounds to our economy that it is today." He also points out how little restrictions these coders had, and with their new education on computers mixed with the disconnect from authoritative figures, they were given the chance to let their creative side flow freely in ways that were so new and revolutionary. To this day, thousands of games were created by people within the comfort of their own homes hoping to break out into the world of success, or just their own kind of passion projects. Game creators such as Scott Cawthon, creator of the now infamous Five Nights at Freddy's games The Desolate Hope and Ifamoon, and a plethora more, Toby Fox, the creator of Undertale and Deltarune, and Sean Murray even created a small company named Hello Games to create and then further down the line restore the reputation of No Man's Sky, which, by the way, Internet Historian does a fantastic video lamenting the whole story behind No Man's Sky. I would highly recommend. These creators came out of nowhere, but they're some of the best examples of modern day bedroom coders and show that 40 years later, people within the industry or wishing to break in start in similar ways to the pioneers. The rise of the bedroom coder also helped bridge the social and economical differences within the industry. Not all video game developers have the same opportunities and facilities, making it seem like if you wanted to be part of the industry, you'd need to have the right education and technology to be welcomed into a company. These creators contributing to this medium within the confines of their own home, with whatever resources they had, really set a precedent that you don't always need to have the top spot in a company or the conformity of a group company project to create this type of art. By working independently, they have full autonomous control of their project and shows that people today, with enough passion and determination, anyone can break into the industry in a meaningful, impactful and groundbreaking way. Manic Miner may not look like much, especially comparing it to modern day video games. However, without it and others like it, game development today would be so drastically different. It shows us where video games come from, which I think is a very important thing to have an awareness of if you have an interest in making video games, analysing video games, and even just playing them to see where they come from. Manic Miner really set the bar high for what people can achieve with just enough dedication and drive. Though it seems Manic Miner has, with time, faded into obscurity amongst the video game community, it will always be the forefather of what the industry has become, to which I think is something that anyone with a passion towards the industry should appreciate.